안녕하세요. I will not torture you with my Korean again this morning. But I am very happy to be here, to have the opportunity to present some of my work to you. I'm very grateful to Professor Song and all of the members of your department and your institute for inviting me. It's been a wonderful experience for me, my first trip to Korea. And on the way over, I studied and learned fairly well the Hangul alphabet. And when I did that, I was extremely impressed with how wonderfully the alphabet reflects the language. And then when I got here and went to the museum and saw the huge exhibit about King Sejong, and saw what he did, when he did it, that is so early, more than 500 years ago, he's become my new hero. Because I think it's a wonderful alphabet, one of the best I've ever seen. So, and the fact that we're dealing with alphabets today, you see, is very appropriate. I think perhaps, since I'm not speaking to an American audience, it would be a good idea to explain my title. Pulling out all the stops may not mean anything to you, but this is a pun, kalambur, when someone plays the organ. The little buttons that you pull out are called stops. So when you pull out all the stops, it means you open the organ to play absolutely everything. Of course, stop also means a vzrivnoy zvuk, right? So that is also a stop. And a riff is something that you hear in jazz when you have a particular melody and then you do variations on it. Each one is called a riff. So my melody today is G. And I'm pulling out all the stops, and you'll see why later. What I'm going to talk about today is focusing on change from within, what Henning Anderson has termed evolutive change, where change evolves from within the language itself. And this kind of change is largely prompted by what the late Edward Sapir of Yale University called drift. And I'm sure you've all heard of drift, this tendency of languages to evolve by altering elements and relations over time. And as certain parts of a linguistic system change, that has an effect on other parts of the system, and then they begin to change. And then that has an effect on other parts. And so these parts keep affecting one another as the drift goes on. They demand some sort of response. So what we are going to see in today's presentation is that such changes in structure are not limited to specific levels. A change in the sound system will not only affect other parts of the sound system. It can have an effect on the morphology as well, and vice versa. Today we're going to look at historical change and its place in the broader field of Slavic linguistics. Now, it may seem very myopic, even pedantic, to try to provide insight on historical Slavic linguistics by focusing on one single sound, G, among the East Slavs. I mean, a G, of course, the letter in the English alphabet is G, so a G is a G is a G, or a G is a G is a G. But what can we possibly learn from such a microscopic view? I could say Gamelot, but that would really set a low standard for punning. Still, this single distinctive sound in the history of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian really provides a treasure trove of material that illustrates in microcosm just what historical linguists do with language, what kinds of questions they ask, and how they go about coming up with answers. The patterns that we find and the methods that we use turn out to resonate in the general study of cultural production, whether we're dealing with written text or as in literature or in ritual or in art, the same principles can apply. So, first of all, a prelude to our three riffs. My three riffs are going to concern what? I've already given it to you on the handout, but we'll do it anyway here. Let's see if we can line up the machines again so that they're talking to one another. Okay. illogical spelling in Russian, namely, and then asymmetrical morphology in Ukrainian and Belarusian, and finally, the sociolinguistic effects of the traces of G. These are three different themes that I'm going to be talking about this morning. The sociolinguistic effect of the development of G includes the barking of Russian dogs and the marking of Ukrainian money. And you're going to have to wait till the end of the lecture to find out how I possibly bring those two things together. But now that I have your attention, let's consider the phoneme G itself. What are its properties? And how does it fit into the grand scheme of consonants? What are the properties of G, and how does it fit into the grand scheme of consonants? All of you have taken courses, I'm sure, a course in the structure of Russian. And so you know that G is what? If I can get this to work. You know it's produced at the velum, right, at the soft palate, which we all know can be found. You all know where the velum is. Okay. It is a stop, complete closure. It is voiced, which we know is connected to the vibration of vocal cords. And it is paired with K as being its voiceless partner. And we could look at G as simply K plus voicing. So you take a word like rog, and in final position, the G sounds like K, rog. This is all elementary information, and I'm sure you all teach it to your students so that they know how to pronounce things correctly. Now that means that rok, the word for fate, and rog, the word for horn, sound exactly alike when they're pronounced when the G is in final position. Now what are the voicing rules in Russian, just to make sure that we know them well? Obstruents, D-voice in final position. We know that. So we already see that rog, the G sounds like a K. The D in god sounds like T, got. And the B in lob sounds like lop. That is, voiced becomes voiceless in final position. We know that in obstruent clusters, in the middle of a word, there's voicing assimilation. So that vodka, where you have a voice together with a voiceless, the last member of that cluster always determines the voicing. So vodka becomes vodka. Prosba becomes prosba. Voiceless voiced becomes voiced voiced. Okay? So these are the basic rules of voicing in Russian. But we can also look at G from another perspective. That is the perspective of acoustics, from sound waves. And it really behooves us, it's important to keep acoustic features in mind when we try to gain a sense of what the phoneme G is. Because you see, vibration of the vocal cords is not all that is happening when we produce voiced consonants. The muscles at the point of contact actually become slightly more relaxed, lax, in other words, whereas they become more tight or tense when the consonant is voiceless, Gesundheit. A lax stop disperses a smaller amount of energy, of acoustic energy, over a smaller space. Let's view that. Let's see, are we working again? Voicing entails vocal cord vibration, slight muscle relaxation, we talked about this, and the acoustic feature involved is tense, lax, rather than voiceless, voiced. What does that entail? A tense stop disperses, spreads a larger amount of acoustic energy over a larger range of the spectrum, from low tones to high tones, over a longer period of time. Whereas a lax stop disperses a smaller amount of acoustic energy over a smaller range of the spectrum over a shorter period of time. So those are other characteristics of what we think of as voiced or voiceless that we need to keep in mind when we're considering the phoneme G. This is important for us because of the fact that every speech community has options as to what will be considered phonemic in connection with voicing. So, for instance, the acoustic features of voiced, voiceless are usually in complementary distribution with tense lax. And usually a language will choose one or the other as phonemic. So, for instance, voiced implies lax. Lax implies voice. You don't need both of them to be distinctive at the same time. Usually one is distinctive and the other is redundant. Likewise, voiceless implies tense, and tense implies voiceless. And so I've color-coded this so that I think it makes it clear which is connected with which. Now, some languages seem to choose tense lax, others choose voice to be phonemic. Therefore, one is typically phonemic and the other is redundant. Now, what happens if we try to maximize the difference between members of the opposition? In a voicing language, what will be the maximum distinction? It will be one where a consonant is either fully voiced or fully voiceless. You know, you can have partial voicing. So that in order to make them as distinct as possible, you would make one, leave it completely voiced, and you'd make the other completely voiceless. So g as opposed to k. Completely voiced, completely voiceless. What happens in a tensing system? Well, you actually have two options. One option is to be fully tense. You can make the muscles so tight and so tense that you actually affect the way that the voicing of the vowel is pronounced after the stop. And that leads to aspiration, as we have in English. So, for instance, English words like pin, tin, kin all have aspiration. There's another language that's spoken in Seoul that also has aspiration. I believe it's called Korean. So Korean is also a tense, lax language. Russian, however, is a voiced, voiceless language. Now, in addition to having aspiration be one of the ways in which you can maximize the distance, another is to maximally make the consonant lax. And what does that mean? You make the muscles looser and looser and looser. And what kind of effect will that have on a stop? You'll lose closure. You will lose the stop. It will become a fricative. And that is called lenition. Since you've all read articles by Henning Anderson, I know you're familiar with the term lenition. To lose the stop. So one of the ways that we're going to be pulling out all the stops is to see whether or not closure, stop, the quality of being a stop, remains or it gets lost. Now, we need to make one more note on tonality. Velars like k, g, h, and h, and labials like p, b, m, v are all low in tonality. If we look at a spectrum, they're all pronounced in the lower part of the spectrum. Whereas consonants, and that by the way is called grave. In acoustic terms that's called grave because it's low. Whereas dentals like t, d, s, z and sh, zh, ch are actually pronounced higher in the spectrum. And those are called acute. Okay, so we need to remember that. Keep that in mind. Which consonants go together? So here's riff number 1. C'est la vie. And you see the question written on your handout. So we'll go over that in a minute. You can compare two common Russian words, phonological words, spelled with the letter G. One is mnogo, and the one is zimnova. Now, the last three letters, of course, are identical. And a new student of Russian is amazed to learn that they are pronounced differently. That you say mnogo with a G, but zimnova with a V. Certainly weird, I think you would agree. Armed with this information, they forge ahead, only to come to a screeching halt when you ask them to transliterate from Cyrillic into Roman letters. How do you transliterate from Cyrillic into Roman letters? What do I write after the accented O? Do I write a G or do I write a V for these words? Welcome to the wonderful world of linguistic levels. The orthographic level is indifferent to sound. It doesn't care about sound. It only cares about letters. So therefore, the only thing you can write for both is G. Right? For transliteration, za mnogo is written za mnogo with a G, and zimnova is written zemnogo with a G, because we're only talking about letters. The phoneme, however, between the two O's, that is what is different. At the phonemic level, that's where the transcription differs. So that Za mnoga will be written phonemically za mnogo, with a g, whereas zimnova will be written with a v, because that's what's actually pronounced. Now, this information is all we need for a structural description of Russian. But of course, the historical linguist, I should say a good historical linguist, isn't satisfied with that. He or she wants to know why. How did this come about? It's very strange. It's not immediately obvious. An examination of the oldest manuscripts in East Slavic territory show that the genitive, singular, masculine, and neuter ending for adjectives and pronouns, which is o, ge, o, is written with a g, always. So the spelling with g, but pronouncing with v, is clearly an anachronism. It goes back to an earlier time, the spelling with g. What does other East Slavic evidence tell us about this ending? The ending in Russian, as I say, that's what we call the earliest version of the language. We don't use the term, at least this is a Harvard tradition, we don't use the term Old Russian, because how can we call something Old Russian when there was no Old Russia? There was Rus. And so we talk about Russian, and that makes the Ukrainians and Belarusians a little happier. They don't think that they're somehow out of the picture. The Russian ending was o, ge, o. If we look at modern Ukrainian, the ending is o, ho, o, ho. The Belarusian ending is o, ho. The South Russian ending is o, ho. But the North Russian and Central Russian ending is o, vo. So in other words, from a dialectal point of view, there's something interesting going on that we have to try to explain. Why is it only in part of East Slavic territory that we have a v, and everywhere else we have a h? Nobody says g anymore, but still we only have v in the north and in the center. It turns out that, of course, we can now understand what this is. What is h? H is nothing but a lenited g. When g loses closure, it goes to h. So lenition, therefore, seems to be important here. And it's useful to note that the lenition of g to h, the loss of closure, and all the stages in between, takes place not only in East Slavic, it's actually a general Slavic phenomenon. So it's very important, and this is why dialectology is important to consider in this, to look at a map of the Slavic languages and see where this change takes place. And when we project that change onto the same map, we see that that is the area where g goes to h. And you see that it affects all of Czech, Slovak, of course all of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and South Russian. So it is very much in its own way, a central Slavic phenomenon, as opposed to the periphery where g remains, or something else in general. G, of course, remains down here too. So what we see is this lenition happening in the center of Slavic territory, but g remaining in the periphery. So lenition seems to be a central Slavic innovation that also affects East Slavic. And it affects, and we can see it geographically, that it affects this part closest to the center, that is Carpathian Ukrainian, the rest of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and South Russian. And only when it gets to this part does it not take place. So it really seems to be a change that comes out from the center and only goes so far. It didn't, so in other words, even though lenition takes place, it doesn't seem to have taken place with enough consistency in the areas where we see g to stick, to stay, to remain. So the v in the ending in Central and North Russian is really the only place where it is limited to v, whereas the original g has changed where it has everywhere else to h in all of this other territory. So of course not only is the ending oho in all of these areas of East Slavic, but all the other g's are h too. In Ukrainian, you say noha for naga. And the same thing is true naha in Belarusian. So all of the Gs go to H. So that's not surprising that it would happen in the adjectival ending. And so therefore, that's telling us something strange about what happens in Central and North Russian, that it's limited to one grammatical ending. And that's interesting. Now, if we assume, along with Henning Anderson, that Common Slavic, which we say is the ancestor of all the Slavic languages, originally was distinctly tense-lax rather than voice-voiceless to begin with, then lenition is a perfectly understandable phenomenon. One of the ways of making the opposition as different as possible is either making the voiceless, the tense consonant, aspirate, or making the last consonant lenited. And lenition is something that we see here. It turns out also that the loss of closure in G, lenition, occurs more consistently in some environments than in others. It happens more consistently and more frequently between vowels than it does at the end of words or at the beginning of words. And that's important to keep in mind because, of course, the ending that we're thinking about has G between two vowels. So that's an environment that will favor lenition. Once the process of lenition is halted by something, we'll talk about that something in a minute. Maybe some of you can already guess what that something is that halted, caused the process of lenition to stop. Once that happens, then the community is left with this new sound, and they have to make sense of it. There was no problem making sense of it in Ukraine and Belarus because all of the Gs went to H. But what do you do in a territory where only some of the Gs have gone to Hs? For instance, in the adjectival pronominal ending. But it didn't yet happen in a word like gorod or in a word like rog. Then what do you do? If the newly emerging H appears in a grammatical suffix, that's a special, very, very special environment. That's a morphological environment. And that new sound, therefore, is interpretable not only within the context of the system of sounds. You don't have to only figure out what sound it is, but how does it relate to all of the sounds that are used in that particular grammatical ending? That's also important. And Roman Jakobson, early in his career, pointed out that the case endings in nouns and adjectives and pronouns actually are based on a very small subset of consonantal sounds. Not all of them are used. There's no b, for instance, right? There's no z. There's no t. If you really go down, you'll see that most of the consonants are not used. It's a very small inventory. In fact, you will see that there are really very few that are used. And therefore, with that in mind, what might lead speakers of Central and Northern Russian to reinterpret the sound h in specific suffixes as a v? What might lead them to do that? Here's where the reference to acoustics rather than articulation is so important, and why I wanted to introduce that aspect. What about the sound h? Let's look at it for a moment, acoustically. We already know what the reflexes of East Slavic g are. In South Russian, we see nothing but h, yeah? Everywhere. In North Russian, g, but zimnova, only in that adjectival suffix, or the pronominal suffix. Why is g to v limited in North Russian and Central Russian to the ending in ovo? Here's the likely scenario. You start in the center, and you move to the periphery with lenition. It begins to occur in Central Russian, and then in North Russian, but inconsistently, advancing in some contexts earlier than others, and we know where, between vowels. So, of course, that favors that particular ending, which we already know. Okay, but something interfered. Now we have to figure out what the something is. What got in the way? What made lenition stop? It wasn't an invasion by the Swedes. The year shift, the famous fall of the years, Padение Yerov, right? This was, as we know, it was the loss or reinterpretation of the central vowels back year, also called yor, and front year. They either were reinterpreted as other vowels, usually o or e, or they disappeared. You know all about weak and strong years, I think, if you've had Old Church Slavonic. So this had a tremendous effect on the system of vowels. In fact, it reduced the system of vowels dramatically. it nearly doubled the number of consonant phonemes, because it was with the loss of the years that phonemic palatalization came into being. Before that time, it was always possible to predict when a consonant would be pronounced soft or hard. But if you take a word like gost that ends in a front year, the front year is telling you that the T has to be soft. But now you take that front year away, and the T is soft by itself, that makes it phonemic, that makes it independent. So it almost doubled the number of consonants and reduced the number of vowels by half. And it introduced vowel zero alternations into the morphology. So famous things like son and sna, that's when they came about, as we know, from the year shift. Now, all of those changes, those are major changes. And that is what forces the issue of interpreting inconsistent results of emerging h. I mean, when the community is trying to figure out which consonants are phonemic and which are not, and all of a sudden there's this funny sound h, what is it? Is it an independent sound? Is it an allophone of some other phoneme? That's where they have to interpret what it is. And in most cases, the sound h was believed to still belong to the phoneme g, which hadn't yet changed in other environments. And what the community does in that case is it brings back the stop. It puts g back in there, and then everything is fine. Then there are no problems. Okay, that's called remedial. Yeah, just like remedial reading, to bring you up to the proper level. But the ending o, ge, o was different, because the h in o, ge, o was not only in the most favorable environment for lenition, that is between vowels, it was in a grammatical suffix, an ending. And here's where I say that the consonantal inventory of endings is very limited. For adjectives and pronouns and nouns, there are only 3 obstruents that are used, g, ch, and s, and there are only 3 sonorants that are used, m, yod, and v. Nothing else is used. So now this h comes into the picture. And how will it be determined? Well, one interesting thing to think about is, what kind of consonants are these? S is a fricative. H is a fricative. What is a h? A fricative. So that actually joins that in a better way than g, which is a stop. So that's one impetus already to maybe get rid of g and substitute h there. Now, what about the acoustic properties of h? Because remember, h, what is it going to be phonemically? There's no phoneme h in Central and North Russian, so what is it going to be? It had to be reinterpreted, but as what? Well, let's look at its acoustic properties. It is non-nasal, it is grave, low in tonality, it's voiced, and it's continuous, it's not a stop. It turns out that there's only one other consonant with those properties that it might be identified with, and you can already guess which consonant it is. Therefore, a hearer can begin to hear this h and think that it must be a v. That's what makes sense. That's what acoustically makes sense. It's low in tonality, it's voiced, and it's continuous. Now, the question is, why would you replace a sound that's produced at the back of the mouth, the velum, with a sound produced in the front of the mouth at the lips? V is a labial, after all. Well, from an articulatory perspective, it makes no sense. Right? I mean, there's no articulatory way of connecting what's made in the back of the mouth with the way in the front of the mouth that makes much sense, other than an arbitrary term, like peripheral. But that doesn't really tell you much. But acoustically, it makes a lot of sense, because I've just given you all of these features that are shared between these two. The link of h and v makes sense acoustically, but not articulatorily. And therefore, from an acoustic perspective, that's supported. It also turns out that there are other grammatical suffixes that use v, and that they share grammatical features with the very ending we're working with. Remember, the ending we're working with is genitive. And the genitive plural ending for type 1 nouns is off with a v. There is a possessive adjective suffix. One of the major meanings for genitive is possession. Like off, as in bratov. Like Bratova kniga, Ivanov sin. So there's another v. So those two suffixes also support the notion that this suffix that had the meaning genitive should also have v rather than g. So that ends our first riff. And I hope you're totally convinced that that's a better way of looking at it than trying to think of the fact that it's accidental, or that the other theory had it that the g between O's simply began to weaken and be pronounced like h and then disappeared, and in order to fill hiatus, the natural thing was to stick a w there. But of course, if that were true, that process could also happen in South Russian. When you get a h between two O's, it could also disappear. And that could also be replaced by w. So why did it only happen in one place and not in the other? That's why that other theory, I think, is weak. But this one makes sense if you understand it from the perspective of dialect geography. That the change of g to h did not happen consistently, and therefore h was much weaker in the north and had to be interpreted as something else. Okay, let's go on to the second problem, which is called birds of a feather. This is from a famous English saying, birds of a feather flock together. Things that are alike behave in the same way. In Common Slavic, the formation of infinitives is fairly straightforward. And any of you who have had Old Church Slavonic know it's pretty easy to do. You just take the second stem, which is called the aorist infinitive stem, and you add the suffix t. Very easy to form the infinitive. So, vowel stems are the easiest. So you take a vowel stem like chodi, you add t, and you get the infinitive choditi. Or you take duma, and you add t, and you get dumati. Easy. Vidya, you add t, and you get vidyati, to see. Now, consonant stems are a little trickier. You take nes, and you add t, and you get hot chocolate. No. You get nesti. All right? You add vez plus t, and now all of a sudden these consonantal changes are beginning to take place. The voicing rules apply. And the z devoices to s before t, and you get the infinitive vesti. That's how it was spelled in Old Church Slavonic. The infinitive for vezon, vezeshi, vezeta, that was pronounced vesti with an s. You take a stem like vedti, and you get dissimilation. The d loses closure and becomes an s, and that also is vesti. You take an infinitive based on b, and you add t, and the b is truncated, and you get greti. That's the old form of the infinitive. And then the hardest one of all, you take the velar stems, like pek plus t, and in East Slavic you get pechi. So it seems that that cluster k-t before the e becomes a palatal velar k, which in East Slavic is identified with t-yot and becomes ch. So we get pechi. Whereas in Old Church Slavonic, you remember it's peshti. And in Czech, it's petsi. Right? Okay. And the same thing is true for a velar infinitive that ends in g. So mog plus t gives you mochi. Why? Because the g devoices to k, and then we get exactly the same change to ch. All right, now, this is an interesting problem of interpretation, because now it's not so clear where that boundary is for the infinitive. We suddenly, the t has disappeared. And how do you interpret it? Is it pech plus e, or is it pe plus chi? Not so easy. And so what seems to have happened is that there was a reinterpretation of chi as a new infinitive suffix for velar stems. Instead of using t, you use chi. And what does that mean then? How do you interpret what happens? That means that the k truncates. So pek chi becomes pechi. So truncation, in other words, is extended. It not only happens in the labial stems, but also happens in the velar stems. But Slavic doesn't stop there. It says, well, if we can have truncation, why not actually allow for further reinterpretation of infinitive stems? It actually spurs a reanalysis of all the consonantal stems, and introduces another new suffix now, sti, so that now old nesti is reanalyzed as nes plus sti, and the first S drops off, truncates. Likewise, vesti is interpreted as vez plus sti, and the Z drops out, and you get vesti. Likewise, ved-ti, the D drops out, and you get vesti. And also a stem ending in T will be analyzed the same way, misti. Greti can be analyzed as greb plus sti, and that's where the innovation comes from. In modern Russian, we say gristi for gribu, gribyosh. That was not the original suffix, but that's how we get the suffix, when that sequence of s-ti is reinterpreted as the new suffix. So everything looks wonderful, and you see it coincides perfectly with pek-chi, gesundheit, and mok-chi. So we have nothing but truncation in the consonantal stems. Perfect. No problem. Yet. Then we continue on, and we see that speakers in certain dialects begin to want to restore that stem final consonant that was lost. So in North Russian, let's say, when they're pronouncing pechi, of course they're truncating. And with mokchi, they're truncating. But what happens if they don't truncate? Then they begin to get forms like pekchi. If they decide they're not going to truncate that k, they can get pekchi. And of course, this kind of cluster was tolerated after the air shift. Before the air shift, it was not allowed. But after the air shift, these new consonant clusters came into being, and this was tolerated. So it had an effect on morphology, and we actually see these forms today. There are North Russian dialects today that have forms like pekchi. But then they go on, and they also have forms like mokchi. But then they decide, well, if we're innovating, why not even go further? Let's get rid of chi. It's too different. Because we know we still have hoditi, yes? So why not take the T and generalize that? And that's exactly what they do. They replace chi with productive T, and they get forms like pekti and mokti. And that also occurs in North Russian. So what's really interesting is that these North Russian dialects have actually reproduced the original common Slavic form. By a series of innovations, they've actually come back to the same form that Slavic started out with. This all looks fine, no problem, everything is wonderful. But of course, that's not why we have number 2 here. Something funny happened, and that's what we have to figure out. Now, if we look at the progression of innovation from pechi to pikti, so here we have first a territory that's pure and pristine, only has pechi. Now we have part of the territory that decides to eliminate truncation. So now we have dialects that say pekchi, and older dialects in the periphery. Let's call this a central innovation, and this is peripheral. Now we have these peripheral dialects that preserve the old form, whereas these innovating dialects have the new form with truncation. Now we go a little bit farther along, and now we are allowing suffix innovation here. So we actually have 3 different dialect areas, each one showing the effects of this innovation. So with that in mind, and you can see it can continue on, where this nice new innovative form can actually spread and take over most of the territory. Now this is reduced to this part here, and here these archaic dialects, they're really way in the periphery, trying to hold on to that old form. So now, if we look at Belarusian and Ukrainian, we get a different picture from what we saw in Russian. The Belarusian conundrum, the Belarusian puzzle. Why does Belarusian do what it does? Belarusian has, in the literary language, the voiced infinitive is machchi, which phonemically is mochchi. So we know exactly what that is, right? This is just eliminating truncation, and the h comes up before the ch. Okay, that's no problem. That's exactly corresponds to mogchi in North Russian. But the voiceless one still truncates. We get piechi, and that would look like this. So here, one in the same language, in the same literary language. The voiceless one preserves the archaic form, and the voiced one has the innovation in the same infinitive. That's funny. That's weird. Just like our V in the adjectival ending. It's weird, and once again, a historical linguist wants to know why. And we compare this with Ukrainian, which has mokhti and pekti. So in other words, Ukrainian is completely symmetrical in the way that North Russian is symmetrical. So this is strange. Why do we have this Belarusian conundrum? And we can't just say it's because the Belarusians are funny. We have to come up with a better reason than that. So let's look at the dialect map and see if that helps us all understand what's going on. We see that there is this large territory here in, actually, if we include both Ukraine and Belarus, that we get this territory right here in the corner that still preserves moche. That's the Ukrainian archaic forms. This whole area is that yellow, and this whole area is that yellow. So what we see is that in Ukraine we have this little area down here in the Carpathians which has very archaic features that preserves the old ending and the old form. Here is this band that is just represented here at the edge of the western part of Ukraine, and then still forms a rather large part of the Belarusian territory. And then this very large area that encompasses most of Ukraine and extends into Belarus. So you see there are Belarusian dialects that have the equivalent of mokhti. I'm sorry, mokhti. And mokhti goes all the way up here. But that's the voiced version. If we look at the voiceless or tense infinitive, then we get a different story. Notice that the archaic territory is not only here in the corner of Ukraine, but actually goes all the way up into Belarusian territory. It's this whole area here. And that indeed is what the literary language is basing its form on. Minsk being right about here. So that even though Belarusian started that innovation and has the equivalent of pikti here and pekchi here, the literary language has formed the basis of this. So that's why, with two very different distributions of the archaic forms and the innovative forms, Belarusian is asymmetrical. But what does this also tell us? If we look at this map, it is telling us something about the rate of progress of this innovation. If we had to determine which innovation happens earliest and most consistently and spreads the fastest, then we have to say it is, which one? Has to be the voiced one. The voiced one has started earlier, been more consistent, and spread farther, so that, this entire area has the innovation except for this little corner. Whereas in the voiceless part, the innovation has not spread as far. We still have all of this peripheral territory that has yet to experience the innovation. So for some reason, the k spreads more slowly than the h. Why should that be? So let's see if we can understand. Why do stems in h, in h, innovate or lose the truncation rule faster than those in k in Ukrainian and Belarusian? The Russian stems seem to be symmetrical. And here's where we want to think about what Russian really was. Maybe not only Common Slavic was tense laxism to begin with, but also Russian. And then later, with the fall of the Years, we could get a different choice. If that's the case, then how do we determine what happens in clusters of obstruents? It followed the normal cluster voicing assimilation rule, producing only lax, lax, and tense, tense. It looks just like our normal Russian rule, except that we're dealing with the features of lax and tense. So instead of saying when you have clusters it has to be either all voiced or all voiceless, we're saying they have to be either all lax or all tense. So in other words, it looks the same from a phonetic point of view. Thus, Russian nesti with st is tense. Russian vezti is st, tense. But then when the year shift happens, voicing can now be interpreted phonemically either as voiceless voiced, which is what seemed to have happened in Russian and Belarusian, or as tense lax, which is what is still going on in most of Ukrainian. So phonemic, voiced and voiceless, has final devoicing. We've already talked about rog sounding like rok and diet sounding like diet. And it has cluster assimilation. We've already talked about prozba and vodka. But what does Ukrainian do, which has tense lax? Well, this is where it gets very interesting. Ukrainian has no final devoicing. So, for instance, you have the word for grandfather, which is did, pronounced with a d, and you have the word for cat, tomcat, which is kit, pronounced with a t. The cluster assimilation that you get is only to lax, so that prosba is pronounced prosba, but vezti is pronounced vezti. In other words, lax remains phonemic before tense. You can get a contrast before a tense consonant. That turns out to be very important. Why? Why is that significant? Let's think about it. In a voiced, voiceless system, vezti can only be realized as st. So that always favors the truncation analysis, where the z disappears and you get vesti. But in a tense lax system, there is possibility of contrast before the tense consonant. So that means that an innovative analysis without truncation can actually be realized as vez-t, right? If you're not truncating anymore. And the significance is that for lenition, in the Wheeler infinitive innovation, consonant stems ending in stops in Ukrainian ended in t, d, b, and k. And consonant stems ending in fricatives in Ukrainian ended in s, z, and h. Therefore, if you get an innovation that is based on the possible contrast of z before t, as in vez-t, you're also going to affect the other fricative voiced consonants, lax consonants, earlier. Then you will the stops. The stops are going to be affected later. Therefore, the reanalysis of the stems in s and z as non-truncating is generalized earliest and most consistently to the remaining fricative stems, including h, and therefore the h stems get a head start. They start out faster and they spread faster. And that's why we see most of the archaic forms gone in Ukrainian and Belarusian. The poor tense stems have to catch up, and they never do. That's why we see more archaic forms in those dialects. Okay, now we're on to sociolinguistic aspects of G. This is where we're going to bring together some very, very different kinds of information, at least try to explain it in a reasonable way. East Slavic, the central innovation of lenition, we already know is responsible for Ukrainian, Belarusian, and South Russian h, as opposed to North Russian and Central Russian g. The Russian literary language developed on the basis of Central Russian with complementary contributions from North Russian and South Russian. What were the contributions? They borrowed the g from North Russian. Well, they didn't borrow it, they had it also. But they borrowed akanya from South Russian. So voda is pronounced vada, whereas in many North Russian dialects it's still pronounced voda. So what is the fate of h in North Russian and Central Russian? We've already seen that it was a very marked, limited sound, and we saw that in one grammatical environment, namely that ending oho, it was reinterpreted as a v. But there were other places where h was pronounced, and it actually was able to survive, apparently as an extremely marked, very rare phoneme. Namely, in certain religious terminology and in onomatopoeia, that is, imitating sounds. So first let's get some religion. We have to think about the fact that in the mid-17th century, that Ukrainian churchmen were invited to Moscow to help in the correction of religious texts. This was all part of the reform that was carried out by Patriarch Nikon, and what prompted the emergence of the old believers in reaction to what he was doing, wanting to keep the old ways, and he wanted to reform. The Ukrainians knew a great deal about not only the liturgy, but they also knew Greek. Nikon himself didn't know Greek, and so in order to make corrections to the text, they needed experts like this. So the Ukrainians came as experts. Now, what did the Ukrainians say when the Russians pronounced G? They said H. And so they were pronouncing all of these religious terms like Господи and Bog and Boha with a H. And that became the norm, how you pronounce those religious terms. Experts in Church Slavonic tradition, knowledge of Greek and Latin, and they pronounce the letter gamma as a H. And so the letter H was pronounced in church pronunciation. That became the norm for church pronunciation. And it is likely that the Kievan pronunciation of Church Slavonic with a H instead of G was the norm for the church even in the early Kievan period. We assume that Lanishin in the Ukrainian territory took place even before the fall of the Yars. There's good evidence of that. So that already in Kiev during the reign of Vladimir, who baptized Rus, they were already saying a H and not G. But certainly a H was established as traditional by the 17th century and actually remained so into the 20th century. Sumarokov, when he talks about this problem, says G в славянских речениях произносилось как латинское Х, а в просторечии как латинское Г. That is, G in Slavonic utterances was pronounced like Latin H, but in plain talk like Latin G. Surzhykowski, the famous poet and prescriber of norms, lamented the fact that Russian had no letter to represent the sound G properly. This is also in the 18th century. He says, «Нужда в букве необходимая, ибо никто у нас слово «гусь» не произносит так, как оно написано, через «г», то есть как через «г» латинское, по немецкому произношению и польской латыни, но как через «г» латинское же, так, например, «гусь». Однако, все такие слова пишем мы через «г» в противность произношению. So he already recognizes that the need for the letter is a very real one. For no one among us pronounces the word goose as it is written with H, that is, with the Latin sound H, in German pronunciation and the Polish pronunciation of H of Latin, but rather with the Latin G, as in goose, for example. But all such words we write with gamma, but gamma is supposed to be pronounced like H. So we don't have a real letter for G, even though we say G. So he was already struggling with this problem. By early 20th century, the letter gamma is pronounced as a stop G in Russian Church Slavonic, with the exception of a few common words. We all know that we still say Господи, we still say Bog and Boha, and in the early 20th century, they still said Blago. Blago. That's gone already. I think that most people say Blago by now. Thank you derives from the loss of the final H in the optative phrase Spasi Bog. Spasiba. That's the old word for God, with H simply dropping off at the end of the word. Him, Hamlet, Himalai, Hawaii, Henry, Hopak, Hyperbola, Hegel, Homer, Honduras, and later on, Hitler. Except that the просторечное произношение, the common pronunciation of G, ultimately wipes out that elevated pronunciation with H, and now we say the very strange Gamburg, Gimn, Gamlet, Gimalai, Gavai, Genri, Gopak, Hyperbola, Gegel, Gomer, Gonduras, and Gitler. They all sound rather strange. So without a distinct letter to represent g as opposed to h, the latter pronunciation was lost altogether. Now what about onomatopoeia? What about imitating sounds? Russian interjections. You may have read Russian short stories or Russian novels. And one of the characters says, he doesn't really say gm, he says And when he's surprised, he doesn't really say aga, he says aha. So those are still preserved. Likewise, a Russian dog doesn't really say guff guff. He says huff huff, huff huff. So that sound is still used to represent the appropriate imitation. What I've tried to show you today by going through these forms, let me then go through and talk about the Ukrainian experience with h, because of course this letter gamma is pronounced as a h in Ukrainian. That letter h was already h, we said, at the baptism of Rus in 988. In 14th century, where there was much greater exposure to Polish, and Polish of course has g, not h, there was an attempt to render in Cyrillic the pronunciation with g by writing a k before the gamma. And that digraph would represent the sound g. Whereas if just the gamma were used, it sounded like h. And by the way, that kind of spelling is even seen up into the 19th century. So a very famous Ukrainian writer, Kulish, still writes still writes g in that way. Some 17th century texts actually mix in the Latin letter g to represent g. In 1591, for the very first time, they use a new letter, an invented letter, a gamma with a little hook in front of it, to express g, to represent g. This was adopted from an original text that talked about Greek. And 1619, Mileti Smotritsky, in his Grammar of Church Slavonic, used this new letter, g, to distinguish Greek words, which he learned to pronounce under Latin influence with g, whereas the Greeks were saying h, but hey, he was influenced by Latin, so he said g. And the letter already, therefore, had some influence there. But came Peter the Great, and of course, in his civil alphabet, he wanted to eliminate all letters that did not occur in Russian. And since the letter gamma only meant g in Russian for him, he decided that any different letter like g was not necessary, and it was eliminated from the civil alphabet. There was intermittent use in Ukrainian in the 19th century of g. In late 19th century, there's a very famous grammar by Gartner and Smalstotsky that uses that special letter g. And in 1927, it was actually incorporated into this new orthography for Ukrainian, the Kharkiv orthography. But in 1933, the Soviet Union, like Peter the Great, eliminated it from the Ukrainian alphabet. So the Ukrainians now had a problem that they only had one letter, and most of the time it meant h, but sometimes it meant g. There was a very famous article that was written in 1970 by Antonenko Davidovich, which was called Litera za yakoyu tuzhet, a letter for which one longs, the longed-for letter that we need in order to distinguish g from h. After independence in 1989, finally it is reintroduced into the Ukrainian alphabet in 1990 in the new orthography. Now what about Soviet and post-Soviet usage in Ukrainian? Under the old system, we would write Hollywood, and in the new system, we still write Hollywood, where all the stars are from. Whereas a place like Grenlandia, which had no way of being represented appropriately in the old system, is now spelled Grenlandia. But of course, the system is not very consistent. So for instance, the Dutch word is spelled Groningen, when it's spelled Groningen, when in fact in Dutch it's pronounced Groningen. So it's like hypercorrection, but that's the way it goes. To show you what power the form of a letter can have, foreign borrowings coming in from German via Polish are going to be pronounced with g, and it's used in places like words like Grund, from German Grund, meaning soil, ground, or foundation, Gewalt, which means a hubbub, an uproar, or help, and onomatopoeia. Whereas Russian uses h for onomatopoeia, Ukrainian uses g for onomatopoeia. So forms like ged, a gadfly or a horsefly that is a real pest, or gelgotati, to cackle like geese, gelgotati. And then there's the interesting problem of the Ukrainian hryvnia. This is the new Ukrainian money. Well, not new, not so longer much new, since the independence. The Bank of Ukraine had to come up with a decision about how to represent it symbolically. Just like the American dollar is an S with 2 lines through it, or the Korean won is a W with 2 lines through it, how to represent the Ukrainian hryvnia. Well, in the old Soviet system, of course, there was only the letter G. So the Ukrainian bank proposed to use the letter G. Sorry, the letter, yes, the letter G with a G. So it would be pronounced grivnya, really, by, and there you can see it written at the bottom, but it's still written with a H. And that's the way it's written now. And as I said, in early 2004, they suggested that the name for the currency hryvnia should be transliterated as grivnya, according to the old Soviet system, instead of hryvnia, which accurately represents the Ukrainian phonemic value. And there was such an uproar by the public that they later threw that out and they chose the letter H to transliterate with an H and not with a G, to throw over the old Soviet way of thinking about it. So I hope I've shown you what the power of a single sound change can have, of going from G to H, phonologically, morphologically, and sociolinguistically. You can see that what's in a sound change, it appears quite a bit. And 감사합니다.